And that it doesn't really, you can't tell someone how much weight is distributed between the feet in Warrior 2. The only way you would even know is if you had them standing on a scale. And so you can't tell while you're teaching a regular class, a regular person without laboratory equipment. And not only that, but everyone's going to be different because of the length of their bones and, and all these other things. So I was, banging my head on a wall, trying to be like, what am I doing here? How is this useful? And then it really kind of took a turn for me. And I started looking into what I considered, what I would call tissue mechanics, which is a part of biomechanics, but it's really about the behavior and the capacity of tissue, specifically in a biomechanical context, the musculoskeletal system, and even more specifically, connective tissue. So bones, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, fascia, all that stuff, because they're all made of the same stuff. And once I started looking at how those tissues behaved, I finally started finding real value in that data, because now I'm saying, oh, we're having these conversations about injury and safety, and those matter to everybody and all yoga teachers, regardless, and all yoga students. And so now we're having real conversations about it, and we're saying things like, your spine is like a credit card. Well, is it? A credit card's made out of plastic and a spine is made out of collagen. So maybe I should learn a little bit more about collagen before I make statements like that. And so that narrative, still force, it's still biomechanics, but it's a little bit more about tissue behavior and tissue capacity. And that narrative started satisfying like the quest and the inquiry for yoga poses. And now it became a conversation of adapting poses to build up that capacity of that tissue or to back off at certain times. And because now you're talking about individual load capacities, now you're also obviously taking into account pain and pain science and the individual experience, and bringing, tension to areas that need it and taking away tension from areas that don't need it. Mm-hmm. So that's what that statement is to me, the quote that Melissa gave.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is, oops, I almost unpinned you and not pinned you. I think that definitely speaks to really the whole of your practice, but in terms of just a concise definition of biomechanics and why, honestly, I think what I hear mostly from teachers is the intimidation factor, and that, the density of not only your book, but also understanding, do we have to understand calculations and all of these things? And I think what I've appreciated about what you're starting to do, or what you've done really in the last few years of your teaching, is simplify things so much to make this absolutely edible for teachers. And so a little concise, or a more concise definition.
You want a concise definition of biomechanics? Well, therein lies the problem, because the concise definition would be how force affects and acts on the body. But that doesn't mean anything to anyone. So that's the problem. I'll go to workshops and I'll say, let's define biomechanics, and I'll write on the whiteboard. And people will raise their hand, and people who've taken my courses will give me that concise definition. And everybody else will word vomit a bunch of words. Oh, well, it's about how we move. Like, nobody's quite sure. But the people who've taken my stuff give me the concise definition. And then I say, all right, what do you mean by that? And then suddenly they lose all confidence. So that's the thing with biomechanics, is the concise definition doesn't mean anything to anyone, which is why I spend 6 hours explaining it, so that then when you go to say, oh, biomechanics is about forces acting on the body during human movement or whatever, you at least have the confidence, because if somebody says, well, what is force? You can say something, because that's the first question I ask. Someone says, oh, what's the study of biomechanics and why it's important to yoga, that too, yoga. And people will be like, load. And I'm like, well, what's load? And they're like, So, that's why the book is so dense, because it's like you go through all of this to then be able to go to the concise terms and the concise definitions, but have them have meaning for you. if you can't explain what force is, then why are you using the word, you know?
Well, then, do you want to give a quick or short understanding of force? So someone, you know, uh, it's interesting. I had someone take my class the other day and they're like, it's not like anything I've ever done before. I was like, really? I do it all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. And I feel like everyone teaches the way I do, but they don't, you know, and I, you know, you kind of start to deep dive into, well, this is what you did. But instead, you know, I just think, well, we explore something a little bit different way, because however you place your foot and what you do here, you need to intuitively feel into it. And I just kind of leave it at that. So
Yeah.
how would you explain it? Yeah.
Well, I mean, basically, force is something that you can calculate. It's a measurable item. You can't calculate it with your eyes. That's the problem. So as a yoga teacher, you don't know how much force is being produced by muscles. You need a lab to do that. You need EMG, right? But you can use basic principles if you understand what force is and how it's calculated. You don't have to be able to do the math. You just have to understand the variables, that the actual numerical variables that are considered in force. And if you understand that to be a mass and an acceleration, you can play around with those things. So, you know, the example that I give all the time is if you're standing on a bathroom scale, like in Tadasana, you know, you get a reading, right? Forget what the reading says, you know, for another course, but that gives you an idea roughly of a force value. It's not a force value, but it gives you an idea of a force value. And if you jump on that scale, that value increases. So now you can understand that standing still and jumping have different forces acting on the body. So now you can start to ask questions like, well, people are telling me that yoga is great for bone density. And you can say, well, in the spectrum of activities that are calculating different accelerations, where does yoga fall on that? The standing still or the jumping? And so now you can start to, like, you know, otherwise you just say things like yoga is good for bone density, but you don't understand what that statement means. You don't know what that's considering. You don't understand how bones adapt. You know. So that's why I think biomechanics is important. That's just one example. But in the end, you know, I've been nervous about this, not nervous, but like, I'm like, how am I going to explain biomechanics in 30 minutes or less? Because all my content is like 6-9 hours, because that's what it takes to drive the message home.
Well,
You know?
what I hear you saying is that the force is important because if we're going to make some kind of tissue change or change in the body, then we want different variables of force.
Yes.
So
we want to understand the different parameters. Yep. Load can be different by acceleration. It can be different by magnitude. It can be different by direction. You put your foot in a different way. Now you've got a different direction of a force acting on the body. So you want to consider all of those things. Location, you know, is a marathon runner. Like you could say running is great for osteoporosis because there's high ground reaction forces. But what is it doing if they have osteoporosis in their wrist? Right. The location is not quite, you know, so these are things to consider.
So let's transition just a little bit. Hopefully that gave people just enough to go, oh, I want to understand it more. To why you're introducing biomechanics and breath mechanics. What to you is the overlap there?
Well, the fun thing with the breath is that once you understand what force is, which I haven't really given you, but I'll give you now, you know, it's mass times acceleration. So it's kilograms times meters per second squared. So once you understand that's what force is, then you can understand what pressure is. And pressure is force over an area or a volume. Like these are actually like values that you can calculate. Well, breath is a pressure mechanism, you know, so it is a mechanical force. It just would be calculated over the area or the volume in which it's distributed. So when you breathe, you know, the muscle contraction creates an internal force, right? And what ends up happening is that the diaphragm, as it concentrically contracts, makes the rib cage expand, because the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle and it moves bones. That's what skeletal muscles do. So when the rib cage expands, now you have a pressure differential. Your intrathoracic pressure compared to the atmospheric pressure isn't the same. There's a difference between them. And because we're looking for equality, right? The physical world wants that. Air gets sucked in to your lung space, your rib cage space. So air gets pulled in, and now there's a pressure equality. When you eccentrically ascend your diaphragm, the rib cage expands, therefore the pressure inside goes up relative to the atmospheric pressure, and air gets pushed out. So when we start talking about breathing, it in the context of biomechanics, we're looking at it as a pressure variable. Now, I am fully aware that breathing is also extremely related to chemistry and blood, pH, and all sorts of other amazing things. But that's not the narrative from which I teach. That exists, and I acknowledge that. And of course, when I do breathing stuff in my courses, there's always a reminder, like, breathe even and slow. And if you get lightheaded, like, don't mess with your chemistry that much. But we are going to use breath as a force variable. And so you can breathe into literally different areas. I mean, air is still going into your lungs, but you can use muscle contractions to change the kind of distribution of force, because when your muscles contract, they produce a force within your body, and you can have different experiences. Mm-hmm. So would you like an example, Melissa?
I would love that.
Okay, so if you just sit, right? Okay. We can play around with a few things. Let's imagine that we have like 3 levels of the lungs. And we kind of do. We have an upper lobe, a middle lobe, and a lower lobe. We only have a middle lobe on one side, but don't worry about that. So yeah, we've got these like lungs, and we've got these 3 portions. So go ahead and try to only breathe into the upper lobe of your lungs. And just consider, if you don't know anatomy, just consider your lungs to be in your rib cage. So you can just kind of, I know you can't see my bottom hand, but it's at the bottom of my costal margin. So just cut it into thirds in your mind. And then just breathe into and out of that upper lobe. And just observe what you feel. Notice how you feel in your back and in your shoulders and in your chest. And if you're really tuned in, can you feel which part of your nose tends to get the most swirling of air? And that's just something added that you can play around with. And the idea is that this upper lobe is associated with lift. If you can I wanted to ask you first, but then I want to give you something to hold on to. So that upper lobe is associated with lift. So now try and do let's just jump to the lower lobe, right? If you try to breathe into your lower lobe, it's not going to be as easy. At least for me, it isn't. Somebody might be a little easier, but there's a sense of kind of anchoring if you think of breathing into the lower lobes. And again, can you notice how maybe you breathe differently in the different areas of your nose if you give yourself an upper, middle, and lower channel of the nose? And then let's go to the middle lobe, and you can consider the upper lobe as lift, the lower lobe as depth, then think of the middle lobe as width. And so what happens when you breathe into the middle lobe? And you can just play around with breathing in and out through those 3 areas, upper, middle, lower. And then the fun part, and again, always exploring, do you notice anything with the nose? And I can give you some tips on that if we have time for it. But now you get to play around with, like, you're in a back bend, you're in cobra, right? And some people not everyone's the same. Some people are such lifters already in cobra that they feel a lot of discomfort in their lower back. So we can look at cobra as, well, you should push with your feet and squeeze your butt and all these things. Or we could say something like, breathe into your lower lobe and see if that changes the experience in the pose. So that would be a way to play around with it. There's not like a right way. And that's to that quote that Melissa started with. You don't say, because it's a back bend, you breathe into the upper lobe, because not everybody needs that. Instead, you say, I can do a back bend and I can breathe into 3 different areas, and I'm going to play around with what my body needs or what my students' bodies needs. And so I'm going to give them options. So maybe I do a class on these 3 breathing areas. And each time we come into Cobra, I cue them a different way to breathe after I've taught them, of course. And then the student now gets to say, oh, you know what? My Cobra was transformed by the middle lobe breathing. I like that. I'm going to keep doing that.
Well, it's interesting because it feels in my body more linear when you talk about the lobes, as opposed to, you know, everyone cues, you know, chest, rib cage, belly, right, is the 3-part breath. So how do you see those different, just visually or experientially?
I'm not even thinking of 3-part breathing, because that is even lower when you're doing belly. So this is different than 3-part breathing. This is about taking up the volume, you know, the volume of the thoracic cage of the thorax. And so you can play around with supporting different areas based on different techniques. And it's really hard, and it's kind of esoteric because everybody has a different experience. So it's hard to say, when you breathe into the upper lung, this is what you should feel. I'm just giving you basic guidelines of lift, width, and depth. And that's just something to play around with, but you're always going to have someone that goes, I feel the opposite. And you're like, cool. You know, you can't be like, well, something's wrong with you, you know, but you can give people a general sense. And if you play around with it while I'm talking, you know, you want to compare it to the nose, if you try to like breathe up here, you might naturally breathe into the upper lobes. And if you try to take more in the middle nose, and like keep this idea of air swirling less high, but in the middle nose, you might naturally breathe into the width aspect. And then if you breathe into the lower nose, like right at the entrance, you might feel a little bit more of the pressure and the expansion at the lower ribs. And the lower ribs, they're kind of anchored through the membrane all the way down into the lower body. I'm sitting in a chair, so it's not ideal. But so you can, you know, play around with different ways of experiencing, I guess, you know, experiencing the poses. If you're in plank and you've got someone that's totally disconnected from the pelvis and the lower back, you might be able to just like, and they don't know what's back there and they're not connected to their feet, you know, you might be able to give them, hey, try this breath for a few breaths and see what happens, you know, notice what you feel.
Yeah, powerful. Well, the experience I had with you was probably more than 5 years ago. I don't know if you even remember this. I had frozen shoulder, and you were helping me figure out breathing in order to increase my range of motion, and it worked. It was absolutely like magic. It was completely like magic.
Well, if you think about it, what does breathing do? Now, not on the chemistry side. I acknowledge and respect all of the work on breathing on the chemistry side of things. So 100%, it's just not what we're talking about. So I just need to give that disclaimer. But if you think about breathing as a mechanical function, breathing moves the ribs. It just does. The ribs expand and they rotate. There's very little chance that doesn't happen. And in fact, when that doesn't happen, that's when you get people that are shoulder breathers or neck breathers or back breathers, you know, because they can't move the ribs. So when the ribs, you know, perhaps aren't moving, or when do get them to move, now think about all the structures that attach to the ribs. Well, the spine has many articulations with the ribs. So actually breathing and directional breathing and getting some side of the ribs to move more can actually really change the way you feel in a side bend, a twist, a back bend, forward bend, whatever way you're moving your spine, especially asymmetrical poses. And then think about the entire shoulder girdle sitting on the ribs. So if the ribs are moving, and now we get this change in response, again, the pressure differential, ribs are moving, forces are changing, all of the muscles surrounding the shoulders that anchor to the rib cage are now getting mechanical input from the breathing muscles, intercostals, and all the other accessory muscles from breathing, of which the shoulders are some. And now you get this change, magical change happening at the nervous system, like taking in information and sending out different outputs.
Yeah,
So,
that's what was profound for me. It was just when I, being completely immobile, and all we did was add an element of breath and a little bit of compression so that to breathe again. And it was just magical. So I'd love to shift gears a little bit here. Have our Zoom attendees, and so I'm going to change the view for those of you who are on here. Have you been reflecting on perhaps maybe some burning questions that you wanted to ask Jules? Gosh, now's your chance. So I'll open it up. You can unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat box within Zoom. If you're watching us on Facebook, I'll just take a look at your questions later. So I'll pause for a second if anyone has one. I have one, but
yeah,
I've been not monopolizing. So it was a question actually that I think Maho, who is actually in here, she had asked on Facebook, in relationship to restorative yoga and rest, how does biomechanics fit in that picture, fit in that particular modality of yoga?
There's still a lot that we don't know, of course, but it really comes down to what happens to tissues under tension. And you might not think that you're under tension in restorative yoga, but you are. You're always under tension. Your entire connective tissue body is pre-stressed and under tension. And anytime I move my head in the slightest way, I change the direction and the degree of the tension. So I might be in the most gentle fish pose and I might not feel a stretch, because that's different. That's, the stretch reflex talking to you, but I might not feel a stretch, but I've still put tissues under just a little more tension. So the question in restorative yoga then is, well, what are the parameters of that tension in order to make a difference? And what kind of difference? And so this is where we start getting into the tough part of my book, which is chapter 4, which is histology, which is where we start looking at the microscopic structures of these tissues. And you start looking at a cell. And how does a cell respond? And it turns out in a very basic way with very limited research, but it turns out cells actually do really well in terms of activity, because cells secrete their environment. So the fibroblasts, the cells of your connective tissue, secrete the collagen that makes the connective tissue. And these cells are very responsive to really light stretches, so not really hard stretches, so maybe restorative, and time and long period, not 30 seconds like you would do for a flexibility stretch. For a hamstring flexibility stretch, you would do a strong stretch for 30 seconds or something. But the cells have a interesting response. They become a bit more active when they are held for longer periods of time, a few minutes. Doesn't have to be like 50 minutes or anything like that, just a few minutes. And they do really well under light stretches. That's all I really want to say, because a lot of the stuff's done on bioengineered tendons and we have a lot more to say. So I don't want to go around saying restorative yoga does this and that. We're not quite sure. But we know there's some really positive biological responses. And I think that's really cool.
Thank you. I know it's a lot. I think every question is loaded. Sorry for the pun. And Nachipan, do you want to come on and ask your question? Turn your.
Okay. Yes. My name is Nuchapan. I'm just wondering, if I take the course on this biomechanic, and basically how it's going to change the way I teaching, how to apply this biomechanic into a teaching, into a yoga class, something like that.
You
Meaning
will,
how it make a change for as a teacher and also make a change for the receiver as a student.
yeah. You will leave the course questioning everything you've ever said. I always give the advice on Monday when you go back to teach, don't change anything. You're not ready to change anything. But you will start to notice the things that you say. And you will start to realize that you're saying a lot of things that mean nothing. You're saying a lot of things that aren't necessary. And you're also telling people what to do instead of asking them, giving them options on how to do the poses for them. And so the biggest feedback I get is that my courses take 6 to 8 months to have an effect on you, to really make a change. Because I don't just give you here's warrior 2 and here's a cool way to do it, and then you show up on Monday and go teach it that way. It's not that kind of training. It's really like I give you all this information, and you go out there and you start to suddenly take away things that you've been saying. You start replacing them with open-ended questions, and you start considering different things. And then over time, I get people 8 months later, they're like, I'm a totally different teacher. And so that's what I like about it, is not teaching you how to teach yoga, like the poses per se. I'm teaching you how to think about how you want to teach yoga and what kind of teacher you want to be. And you become that teacher. I don't give you a list of cues. I give you a list of things to consider and empower you with understanding those things, understanding what the difference is between plank here and plank with the arms wide off the mat. What is the difference? Why would you offer one to somebody? Why would you not offer it? The way that I learned workshops in yoga, it was like, well, here's a plank and here's a cool plank. And then I'd go teach everybody this one because I thought it was cool and new, but I didn't have an understanding of why I was doing it and what it meant, and how to even teach it in ways that I can now give an option of arm positions. This is key, an option of arm positions in plank in a group class without overwhelming the students. Because I think what happens is when you start hearing all this, you're like, well, then it doesn't matter. And then you're like, well, just put your arms wherever you want. Well, that's not helpful for the students either, because then they're just like, tell me what to do. So that you have a way of saying, okay, my emphasis today is we're going to really focus on the pecs, and we're going to focus on this anterior shoulder. We're going to get this front of the shoulder strong. We're going to become aware of it. We're going to use the breath to become aware of it. And I'm going to give you a few different options of hand positions to play around with. Each time we all do it this way. And then the last time you get to do it the way that spoke to you the most, that was appropriate for you the most. And now you're guiding your students instead of telling them what to do, which is the opposite, is giving them, put your feet wherever you want. Well, that doesn't do anything for them either. So that's what the training does. It just doesn't happen overnight. You got to go out there and make a big mess of your classes first, and then it all comes together.
Got it. Thank you. And because I actually signed up for your class back last year in April, but then the Kripalu closed, so then the class got canceled. So I was still hesitating with the online, because I thought for me it's like when you do a hands-on face-to-face, you get to learn and understanding more. Would you think that when you're doing an online class, would I get the same benefit?
I mean, nothing compares to the one-on-one partner work that I do in a workshop where you really get to look. But I think it's going to be a long time before that happens. I mean, even if we're back in studios, I think the closeness and the looking and the touching, and I think that's going to be a while. And I like technology, I'm good at it. So I have spent the last year, my first yoga biomechanics course in March was a little odd and, whatever, but I've spent the last year, I've got multiple cameras, multiple speakers, multiple lights, I've got a setup. I'm doing my second teacher training online this year.
Speak to that. Jules is someone who's a study to me, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, Donna Farhi. Jules would be in that category, and of teachers that I've taken from that are a study in leadership and how to convey material in a concise an effective way. And, you know, so part of me, sorry, Jules, for the reveal here, part of me is to continuously retake her material because it's always changing, as I think teachers should always be changing and adapting and learning and growing. And as science changes constantly, that's what Jules does, is continuously adapt all of that. And I think that's really powerful, and that speaks for itself. And you're crazy good at technology, and I've learned a lot on how I want to be.
I've had really successful trainings, and especially like since teacher trainings in summer, like I can power through an online training and keep it exciting. I've got really good feedback, and just keep it like moving and engaging, and breakout rooms. Like, yeah. So as much as I want to be in person, like this is working, and it's working well.
Well, I would say to that too, there's a really interesting element. You know, there was the whole thing about, is it as effective online? Can you do somatics online? And can you really, you know, teach that and have that come across? Actually, I find that my students have way more agency and are, you know, like I took an entire a young art class this week. I had my camera off. I didn't want to be singled out. I was like, don't call my name and tell me to move my hands and then precisely by my ears, and you don't know that I am still working with tissue adaptation.
Frozen shoulder.
Right, exactly. So I'm going to keep my camera off, and I'm going to enjoy it. And I loved it. It was fantastic because I could adapt it for myself without feeling conscious of all of that nonsense. So
yeah, there's benefits. It definitely works. And to be honest, like my 3-day yoga biomechanics course, it was already, when it was live, was already 75% lecture, because we're just talking theory. And, you know, we'd like break into groups because everyone was tired of sitting there, you know, so it, like my work in particular, I think lends itself well to online. I mean, we do workshopy things, but we do a lot of talking and questioning and thinking. And so it lends itself well. I have a lot of slideshows, and you get all that. And the other big thing, I think, is that you get the recordings. You get to review where you missed your notes. And I think that's a big highlight that you don't have when you're in person. You know, you tune out for 1 second, you miss it.
That's true.
So
I was going to say something else that I don't think you, well, you have addressed, but not really specifically. One of the biggest things that comes from this teaching for me as a student and as a teacher is understanding how load is absolutely essential to adaptation and resiliency of our body. And so understanding those principles so differently from this kind of perspective has changed everything in my teaching. And so rather than just teaching a class, having a really great sequence first, you know, and whatever it is, I can actually in the moment tweak something so simple and have a completely different outcome, and understanding how that will have an outcome over time. And that's personal experience. Anyone else? I want to go ahead.
I was going to say, at this point, to me, the yoga, like I used to want to learn how to teach the poses. Now I'm like, okay, we're going to do this pose. What am I going to do with it today? You know, like, what am I going to teach about it today? And it used to be like, well, I want to know how to teach it. Well, no, what do I want to teach about it? So it's like, it opens up your world, I feel like.
Yeah. Things are less in a box. And I think there's so many more opportunities when you have a principle rather than a rule. So yeah. We'll keep the questions open for another minute. If anyone else has another question or two that they want to unmute yourself and ask. Hi, Gina.
Bye, Terry.
Bye, Terry. All right. Well, we'll conclude the Facebook Live portion. So those of you who are watching on Facebook Live, next time you might want to join us actually on Zoom. Continue the conversation when the camera is off. So if you're on Facebook Live, thank you for joining us, and feel free to have a watch party so other people can experience it. I do all of this absolutely for the love. And we've had so many amazing speakers. So if you are within the group and you look at, and you click on videos, you can see all the other presenters that we've had, and they're fantastic. There's a lot of really wonderful nuggets in there, from everything from trauma to breathing. We had a book club this last time on the breathing book, which was really interesting. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch some of those and support the teachers that are a part of the group. So, all right, so I'm gonna say goodbye to Facebook. Goodbye, Facebook. All right, and we'll also stop the recording here.